You're listening to Trek FM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.
This is Steve Sansweet of Rancho Obi-Wan, and you're listening to the 602 Club.
Welcome to your local watering hole for all things geeky. I am just one of your hosts here, Matthew Rushing, and off this week is Christy Morris, so I have filled her seat with none other than Jedi Master John Mills. John, it is just great to have you back here in the 602 Club.
Thank you, but I would never think to sit in Christy's seat. I am, in fact, in my typical hermetically sealed and preserved chair, my bar stool that is preserved for me for every time I come on the show. Christy, I am not in your chair. Please do not hold it against me. I would never do that.
No, we put the you know how your grandmother used to have the plastic over the couch? You know, we put that over your chair until you're ready to come in, and then we unwrap it for you. So, I do not have the time to work a groove in yet another stool. This is perfect the way it is. Yeah. Well, it's going to be fun this week. We're diving into a new Star Wars book. We've got the second book in the Alphabet Squadron, Shadowfall. But just want to say a huge thank you to everybody that's joining us. Don't forget, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts, anywhere from Spotify to Apple Podcasts to any podcatcher out there. If you happen to be, on Apple Podcasts, please do hit us up with a star rating review. Let people know what you think of the show. It really does also help the show grow when you do that. You can find us on Twitter at TrekFM, Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. We got the listeners-only discussion group there on Facebook called the Babel Conference. You can join and talk to listeners all over the world. We are on Instagram at TrekFM, and then, of course, Trek.fm is our website, where you also have a contact section, and you can write Christy and I there under the 602 Club banner, and let us know whatever you have to say about the show or thoughts or anything like that. And last but not least, I want to say a huge thank you to our associate producers here through Patreon, Ken, Tripp, Davis, Grayson, Ryan, Maillet, and Dale Noah. They have been supporting the show for so many years now, and we just really appreciate their support. And also, it is what keeps this network coming to you each and every week. It's a very expensive prospect to put this on each and every week with all the different shows we've got coming at you. So go over to patreon.com/TrekFM, see how you can be part of the team. Honestly, every little bit helps. We've got some great contribution levels as well that have different perks. Again, that's patreon.com/TrekFM. So, John, this book kind of picks up where we left off with Alphabet Squadron. Mm-hmm. And, in the end, this book is really about Alphabet Squadron trying to set a trap to lure, the Shadow Squadron out from hiding to where Alphabet Squadron can fully take them down. Mm-hmm. And this all takes place in this very kind of strange system in the Star Wars universe, Cerberon, and which is orbiting a black hole. So there's no sun, so that's very interesting. And there are a bunch of different planets in this system, and so, we can do a lot of planet hopping as well throughout this book. And I just thought it was really interesting, this whole idea of, one of the things that we've talked about before, especially with Alexander Freed's books, he did the Battlefront book, the first one. And this book is so military-minded. Like, we're talking about a lot of strategy in this book, complex plans of trying to draw in this shadow wing, and to me, that was really interesting to see in this book. Like, this is definitely, as has been said about his books before, he's putting the wars in Star Wars.
Yeah, it's sort of like almost like a Tom Clancy light sort of feel, where it's very interested with the...
That's a good thought.
Yeah, laying out the strategy and tactics and how the ships are working and, the mechanics of it all, giving it... the the credit I'll definitely give Freed is that he does go to great lengths to present a very functional Star Wars universe.
Yes.
You know, the ships, you get the sense of things that go wrong and things that work, and he really, really leans into this idea that the Rebels, or New Republic at this point rather, are fighting with ragtag ships. And he gives, you know, it's easier to convey that visually than, you know, with words. And I think Freed does a very good job of giving, you know, great descriptions of ships and surroundings so that you get a sense of building that mental picture in your head. That's one of the things that Freed, I think, is very, very good at.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, you really get a sense of, you know, when he's describing, you know, whether it's Nath's Y-wing, you know, Will's A-wing, Chass's B-wing, you know, all of these wings seem to be put together with baling wire and spit and maybe some gum, you know, like they're really being held together just tangentially. Like they do seem to be flying apart all the time. And yeah, I mean, like you said, you know, this is a very functional Star Wars universe here in the sense that we are very much in the mode of talking about the military tactics and what these characters are going to do to kind of set this trap for their nemesises. And, you know, one of the things I kind of want to ask you about this whole idea, like, we're setting this trap for Shadow Wing, but I don't know if you felt like this, but I kind of felt like, you know, they were easily dispatched by Alphabet Squadron for the most part and sent into basically exile to have to reform. It seems strange to me that they're so worried about this shadow. Like, they seem to be built this shadowing up big time, and part of that is because we know they were a part of Operation Cinder, which is just horrible thing that, you know, the Emperor had instituted after his death and all. But other than that, I mean, once Alphabet Squadron took them on at the end of that book, you know, they decimate them pretty handily and send them again into exile. So it made me wonder, like, what is it? Was I missing something in this book? Did I miss you know, something that made them this valued enemy that we need to make sure we're putting all these resources into trying to trap?
I think that would be a shortcoming in the book, is that I agree with you that there's very much relying on the idea of their reputation to power the story along and give the sense of danger. And I think that the trap that it winds up springing on itself is that sort of trap that also doomed, in my opinion, a character like Worf in Star Trek The Next Generation, where it was constantly reminded he's a Klingon, he's a fighter, he's a warrior, he comes from a proud warrior race, and then every time he got in a fight, he was bounced around the walls, and it was like, well, Worf doesn't really seem that tough.
Right, right.
But I'm supposed to believe that he's tough, and I'll go along with it.
They keep telling me he's tough, John. Right. He's tough.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's the sort of trap that this falls into, is it's relying on the reader trusting that this fabled Imperial wing is that tough. Well, of course they're that tough. That's why everybody cares about them, and they're monstrous. And we know they're monstrous because of Operation Cinder and all of this sort of stuff. So I mean, I think it's in the best of circumstances difficult to walk the line of character focus and you know, bouncing between the protagonist and the antagonist and those sorts of things. And I just think that sort of added sense of menace is a casualty of trying to walk that balance.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That and you kind of bringing up that whole idea of, like, reputation and Worf as an example was just spot on, because that's kind of how I felt in the book. And even here in this book, you know, they're able to escape the trap and escape with their lives again. But I don't really get the sense that it was because they were necessarily anything special, you know? And I think that's the thing where I wanted maybe just show me something about Shadow Wing that makes them feel almost like godlike, honestly, when it comes to being a fighting squadron that, you know, in the same way that, you know, the Rogue series books, you know, the Rogue Squadron books kind of turned that squadron into this unstoppable force, you know,
right.
You know, with Mike Stackpole's books there. And so where, you know, it just seems like there's nothing that they can't do. And Shadow Wing hasn't really felt like that, I feel like, in this series, other than, again, they followed, you know, the machine Palpatine's commands to obliterate a planet with Operation Cinder. So, I mean, you know, it seems like any wing could do that. It doesn't take anybody super special. It just makes them super evil to have followed that kind of order, really.
Yeah, and the thing is, you mentioned Rogue Squadron. I'm glad that you did, because this is that constant tug of war, and we've talked about this over on Aggressive Negotiations and online and all of that sort of stuff. And this is not a new complaint that I'm lodging, nor do I think that it's necessarily original. You know, I'm sure many other people have had this sort of note about what they're doing with Star Wars right now, and it's one of those things where the nagging sense I have throughout this entire book, and I had it, you know, honestly, through Alphabet Squadron as well, is, oh, well, okay, this is basically going back and saying, well, we had those Rogue Squadron books, and they were really good, and people liked them, so let's do that again.
Right.
But we'll put our own spin on it. And that's just not, that's sort of a problem, is the repeating the formula aspect of everything is, I think, the other trap that this book gets pulled into is it's almost like the black hole is symbolic of Star Wars' legacy, and they're having trouble trying to get away from it. And if they're not careful, it's going to suck them in and crush it all.
You know, I can't disagree with you there, because, and I think, you know, what does this book a disservice is the fact that we do have a representation already in Star Wars literature of a excellent wing squadron series,
right?
That was already beloved. And this one is definitely trying. What I appreciate is they're not trying to just recreate that, in the sense they're just basically doing the exact same thing and slapping a new name on it. But at the same time, I think there was something to the reason that those books were so popular that I would say so far this series has been completely unable to capture.
You know, I want to ask you, though, because I'm not disagreeing with you. I agree with you. It hasn't really been able to capture that lightning. What do you think the biggest hurdle is there? Like, do you think that it's the structure or the approach, or, you know, do you think that this follows a pattern too closely, or do you, like, what do you think is the biggest contributing factor to that?
You know, it is the same problem that I have with most of the sequel trilogy era, which is context. And, you know, again, let me just use the X-Wing books as an example, because it's a good for one, because they're very similar. Those X-Wing books were about the retaking of important parts of the Empire, from the Imperial Remnant. They fight all the way to Coruscant in those books and liberate Coruscant. And so this series seems to be trying to do something similar, in the sense of giving you a taste of what life is like for the New Republic very early, the frustrations that come along with that, of trying to rule a New Republic and trying to quell the imperial resistance that you have. I think the problem is whereas those books, there is a very large picture of what's going on, and you always understand the missions that the X-Wing Squadron is on, why they're on those missions, and why they're important to the larger scope of the Star Wars universe, right? It's not myopic in any way. I would say these books are utterly myopic. They are so hyper-focused on just the story they're telling that I have no idea why these stories are important or what they have to do with the rest of what's going on in the larger Star Wars galaxy. And part of that I get is because as I was thinking about this, this series is before The Mandalorian. So how much leeway really do they have to play anyway? And so I get why they're focused, but I think it truly hurts the story because they just don't have a large enough swath of the galaxy to be able to play with in a way that lets them do something that, again, kind of feels important and that you actually understand why it's important.
See, I think it's very interesting that you hit on that because you're right. This does take place timeline-wise before The Mandalorian. And so that gives us a pivot point that is interesting because, of course, we start focusing on Admiral Ray Sloan, mention of her, and then she shows up at the end and everything, where it feels, again, like there's to speak to your point, there's a disparity in focus in terms of the fact that I've heard about Admiral Ray Sloan. I know that that's a thing that's happening. It's an interesting character. I like the character of Admiral Sloan. But if you're going to set something in this specific time frame, I need it to do more to advance what the story is, like the world building, if you will. And right. I think that you're right. I think that they're in an awkward shifting point because if this story, this book feels like it belongs much more to the pre-Mandalorian release order mentality of building toward the sequel trilogy, whereas it feels like the rest of the materials that we have and that we're getting are shifting more toward that televised, that Disney Plus focus. So I'm agreeing with you just in a very verbose way, but it's like that this whole thing feels like a slow build to 30 years later as opposed to building context to 5 years later.
Well, and so let me put this in context then with books in this era, right? One of the few books in this era that I have absolutely 100% loved, and I know you did too, was Bloodline.
Yep.
Why is that? Because Bloodline did such an excellent job of giving us an overview of the entire political structure of the galaxy. I truly understood what was going on and why the story was important and how it was leading into what we were going to get in like the Force Awakens and everything like that. It was dropping all these great hints. It helped that Leia was there and truly involved in the story. It felt important for her to, especially since it's the revelation for the galaxy of who her and Luke's father is to everyone. I mean, that kind of thing, like, they were doing something that they hadn't done in the original EU and all. Honestly, Resistance Reborn, I thought was a great book too because it was bringing a lot of things together before you got to that final movie. And this series, to me, the Alphabet Squadron series has kind of fallen into the trap I felt like the Aftermath series did. It has nothing to do with Wendig or his writing style. Really, it was just about not feeling like the stories were as important as they should be. Because this is such a pivotal era of Star Wars, right? This is the rebuilding of the New Republic, and it seems like that should feel like exciting and fun and challenging and dangerous all at the same time, and there seems to be absolutely none of that in these books.
And that is always going to be a difficult thing because people want there are people who want to see something different, something new, something fresh, and that is entirely possible to give us both aspects of that because we're looking at this, to speak to your point, very tight focus here. And you might say, well, wait a minute, this book is about Alphabet Squadron. Why do you need to go out and do these sort of bigger, pieces of the galaxy and setting up the background and stuff like that? And the only thing that I can possibly say to that is because it's Star Wars. That's always important. That's always going to be important.
Yep.
Is the world building in Star Wars. It's all, no matter where it happens in the saga, it's important that it feels a piece of that. And
absolutely.
I don't know. And this is the very difficult thing, is these complaints are not to detract from Freed's talent at all, because he is, like we both said earlier, he's a good writer.
Yeah.
He knows what he's doing.
And we both liked Battlefront too. So
And so it's not a reflection on him. This is more a reflection of a good writer given, I think, too narrow lane to stay in.
And that's not his fault. He can only do so much. I mean, he did the best he could with what he had to work with, I think. And because you can only give you the rope that they're going to give you when you're writing a tie-in novel. That's it.
Right.
So I truly feel like there's a lot of things he's just being held back from being able to do. And that's not necessarily on him. And again, I say this book tries to make as much as possible of the characters and the situation that he's got to work with.
You know what? I think that is a spot on thing, is that it's too conservative. It doesn't feel like he's allowed to go for broke. I get the essence through this book of a writer who wants to push for something big, but is told to pull back on it.
Yeah.
And so he goes as big as he can, but he's not allowed to go where his instincts are taking him.
Right. Well, and that's what was really interesting, because to me, this has an Empire Strikes Back feel as a book, where all of the characters are not together much. We kind of segregate the characters into different groups doing different things, which allows us to be able to learn more about them. We really got to see Will and Nath kind of grow closer together as friends, which I thought was interesting. We also saw Will kind of grow into a leader, which he was not expecting to have happen, which was kind of neat to see that leadership come out of him and actually have Nath kind of come, basically under him and be like, I don't want to be the leader, but I'll support you as the leader because I think you'll be a good one. We learn more about Chas and her history, and what makes her the way she is, where she comes from, why she is so kind of self-destructive. Kairos and Adon, we learn why they're so close, because that first book, it alluded to that they had this really deep relationship, and we get to really dive into that story. And we also, by the end of the book, we have a full reveal of who she is. She's completely unmasked by the end, in every way possible, in the sense that she shows who she is, after she's healed. And so this book kind of becomes that Empire Strikes Back, where basically, nothing goes to plan. And actually, when you look at where our heroes are at the end, they're kind of in a slightly worse position that they were at the beginning of the book, because, Shadow Wings escaped. Obviously, the New Republic doesn't realize, one, that they've also linked up with Admiral Ray Sloan, which is going to be help to them. And two, you got the Palpatine, machine coming back to life, saying, you're just part of this cog in a greater wheel, basically, and let Operation Cinder begin. And we're kind of left to wonder, is this thing malfunctioning? Is it actually coming back to life? Like, what's going on here? So, Shadow Wing kind of ends up, to me, I think, in a better place than Alphabet Squadron does, where their squadron's kind of been decimated, and they've got their leader taken away because of everything that, happened there. And so, again, this book really seems like it's trying to play that kind of Star Wars game of that we're in a more Empire Strikes Back type of feel, which, is not necessarily a bad thing to do when you're doing a trilogy. The problem is, I think it just doesn't quite gel together in the way that you want it to, and part of that all stems from the problems that we were already talking about.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. I don't necessarily agree with it, though, because I don't know if this is just a function of the tie-in books or what have you, but throughout the whole thing, there wasn't a sense of real peril. And I know that we have characters who get wounded, we have characters who die, we have bad things happen, and yes, Shadowwing getting away is a bad thing, but that in and of itself feels inevitable, because I know they're not going to end the series here. So,
right.
You know, of course they're going to get away. So, like, that whole final battle is robbed of any sort of oomph, because I'm like, okay, we're just going to figure out how they get away. And so, you know, and then there's a little surprise thrown in. Oh, with Quell. Oh, okay, yeah, all right, that's kind of surprising. But it's not a feeling of anything but inevitability. Like, this is just the way it's going to play out. And I just...
Yeah.
You know?
No, I completely get what you're saying. And I think the problem with kind of... And maybe you'll agree with this, is the problem of trying to kind of do that one for one, where like, oh, this is the middle book, we need to have the Empire Strikes Back type feel, is that instead of feeling like original, it just feels inevitable, the things that happen.
Right.
And so and that's the thing about Star Wars. Look, you know, the idea of having it rhyme, it can't just be kind of a one for one. And I think that's the thing here, is it doesn't rhyme enough. It's more of a one for one.
And I think that there are so many possibilities for... I was really excited because in the beginning it's like, oh, and it's orbiting a black hole. I was like, oh, wow, that's going to be really, okay, how is this going to play in? And in the end, it's like, it kind of plays in, but not really. And then there's, I just thought also that we're going full spoiler mode here, or do you want me to hold back on anything? Because there's an element from...
Oh, no, we can go full on spoiler mode. Yeah, absolutely.
Because finding basically the Sith temple or whatever with a ship in it was like, oh, okay. All right, well, that's all that is. You know, like it doesn't have the oomph to it, because it doesn't... It reveals itself to simply be, well, I had to get her off the planet, so I might as well have made it interesting. Right. Sort of thing.
Well, and it doesn't make it quite as interesting as even in the first book, where they visit the old Jedi temple that Hera actually knew about because of her relationship with Kanan. Right. And, you know, so where that played more organically, I think you're absolutely right. This plays less organically to accidentally run into a black hole temple, you know? Like, okay, black hole sun, won't you come?
Right.
You know? Yeah. So that's kind of where I'm right there with you. And again, I think one of the things too is that, you know, as much as we really learn about all of these characters and everything, the story hasn't done them any favors to make me feel like their stories are important. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, to where, look, I can read Star Wars books that don't have anything to do with main characters and like them. I have. You know, I mean, let's just take Lost Stars as an example. You know, and, you know, you were able to craft something that made me truly care about these characters. And part of that was because they felt a part of the Star Wars universe in a way that was just exciting and new and fresh, but all this at the same time allowed me to kind of relive everything in a completely new perspective. You know, again, here, I'm just not getting that with these characters, because there's not enough connection to anything else in the Star Wars universe to make me feel like this is truly even a Star Wars book, honestly. I don't even really... Other than the Star Wars terminology, if you took all of that out, this book could have been any sci-fi series out there, and I wouldn't have known the difference.
Right. Well, I agree with that. I think that also one of the things that hampers the book is there's a lot of plot, but not a lot of story. Especially with being split into two parts. Like, my whole sense was like, I get the sense wanting to have a lot of book, but that doesn't make it epic by default. Right? Like you could break
absolutely.
out parts of this and turn it into, over on Aggressive Negotiations, we have the Jedi Book Club where we're rereading those very short Jedi Apprentice books from the prequel era, right? And they're super short books, but there's still a sense they build. It lays into that serial nature. And so I would have preferred to see this turned into a serialized series where Freed is given the opportunity to let it really breathe and just approach it a chunk at a time and just, chip away at it and build up so that eventually by the end you have this big thing, as opposed to this is, it's almost like Death by a Thousand Cuts, where it's like, there's so much going on there. It's one of the big things that undercuts the focus.
Well, and I think one of the things, and truly to that point, we've seen with the Clone Wars, right? You can effectively tell a Star Wars story in 30 minutes or less.
Yes.
And it can be some of the greatest Star Wars you've ever seen. So it's not about length, it's about the story and the characters. And I think one of the things that this does is that we're not being driven by character, we're being driven by plot.
Right.
And I think that's where the disconnect comes in with the characters. And why I don't care about them as much.
Yeah, and again, it's, I know I'm going out of my way to repeatedly say this isn't a reflection of Freed. He writes these characters well, and he really does. He's created some interesting personality quirks and interactions with everybody, but there's this, I don't have, and this is going to sound odd, but there should be somebody within the context of this book or both books or whatever who I'm rooting for. Who,
right, yep.
There's some sort of resonance with that character. And the difficulty, I think, is that there is a character I have that resonance with, but she's not in the book enough for me to spend time with her and be interested in what's happening.
Yep.
Because it's like, if you're gonna bring her in, let's use her.
Well, I mean, it's good. Yeah, it's a great time to talk about the fact that, Hera is in this book more often, which is great. But I think the problem that I have with it is that Hera could be any Star Wars general. It does not have to be Hera. And if you're going to utilize a character in Star Wars, it needs to be that character and that character only. I think back to the story of when they were creating Solo and they were going back and forth with who it should be that was the head of Crimson Dawn. And once they hit upon Maul, it just all came into place. It just made, and it really capitalized on everything that had been done in the Clone Wars to make sense that this is who this character should be. And whereas Hera here, there's really nothing that she does in this series that is anything different than any generic Star Wars general. And if you're not going to use a character and their history and who they are to really play into the series, you're wasting them. And so it's just frustrating because, I love Hera. She's my favorite character from Rebels. And here to have her so mistreated, I feel like, in the sense of just not giving anything important to do, in a way that really benefits her as a character, that's just disappointing.
Yeah. I agree. I love Hera, and it really is something where, because she's just in a generic role and used in a generic way, it detracts from the book. I would have preferred her not to be there.
Yep.
Because every time she showed up, I kept saying, okay, all right, other shoe's going to drop here. I'm going to spend a little more time, find out some more with Hera, have her, et cetera, et cetera. And so it winds up taking me out of the story.
Yep.
Because it's like, oh, well, okay. All right, that's fine. And I think that's just one of those things that you have to be careful as well, because I haven't read as many of these books as you have. I've read a fair number. But the whole Ray Sloan character is interesting to me, but whenever I've encountered her, I only get her in like a chapter or two at a time.
It's true.
And it's like, I feel like I should really care about this character, but I haven't been given a reason to yet. You can't just give me little, like, 10 pages at a time, because there's no way I'm going to connect to her. Right? Like maybe in the next book she has a larger part and there's some sort of history with her and Hera and they really go head to head, but then you're running the risk of, well, you spent these 2 books building up all of these Shadowwing and Alphabet Squadron characters, and now you're going to shift the focus to these other characters that, it just, I think it becomes a great big symptom of these books. And I don't mean these Alphabet Squadron, I mean expanded universe books in specific, about how careful you have to be with the formulation.
No, I mean, I just honestly couldn't agree with you more. And it is frustrating that, she really just, I don't feel like is given the due that she's deserved. And, and it's interesting too, because, Erica Quell is really the character that these books seem to have been kind of based around in many ways. And it was interesting to see, I thought, this theme of like secrets and the fact that, she's had this secret hanging over her head the whole time. It's like a sword of Damocles just right over her head, and we know it's going to fall. And it's what kind of destroys the group. And I just found this so interesting because, it's kind of in light of the world we live in, where redemption really seems out of style. And, if somebody's made a mistake, they're kind of immediately canceled. It seemed interesting to me that in Star Wars, where redemption is such an important subject, that we would immediately disregard this person and say, oh no, all of these people are immediately going to turn their back on her. They're not going to even let her explain. They're not going to talk to her. Nobody talks to her. It just seems like that's not Star Wars, because Star Wars is about characters being redeemed, to me.
Right. Yeah, my entire reaction to that was that when her backstory gets revealed, when she gets outed, as it were, it's just a jerk move, because it's like, oh, I might be dead or missing, and so Erica Quell's a terrible person. It's like, oh, well, what? That wasn't cool. Why would you do that? Like, why would that be your parting, your parting shot with everything? Like, it just, and I know that you're supposed to, I mean, maybe that's the intent, is to be like, oh, well, war is messy and people do, nasty things and everything. But it's like, it totally made me disconnect, because it, like you said, it's not and we've talked about this too, about the whole idea that, to a certain extent, the sequels sort of throw away Darth Vader's redemption. And then there's this move away here from the idea that a character can even be redeemed. And yes, sure. Oh, well, she took part in a terrible, awful thing. Yes, that's true. And maybe her motives for coming to Alphabet Squadron weren't, altruistic to begin with. But that's the idea of redemption being a journey. That
exactly.
You might go to that first AA meeting for no other reason than your friend pressures you into it. And you might even drink after you go to it or something like that. But then eventually you keep going to the AA meeting. And what's interesting is that sort of makes me think of something that I thought was somewhat interesting, was with Chass's character when she winds up falling in with the cult. It's that was kind of interesting, because we get different believers in the Force that aren't the Jedi, that aren't the Sith. And that's an interesting thread to pull on. I would have actually preferred more of the book focusing on that.
Yeah, I agree with you there. The whole Force cult thing was fascinating with Chass, and the idea that, what was fascinating to me to hear that after the Battle of Endor, life removed from this oppression of this monolithic empire, that we are seeing a resurgence in basically religious philosophy throughout the galaxy. Which is fascinating. It's, it makes sense, and what was fascinating to me is that the Children of the Empty Sun here in this system, they talk about this idea of like, the New Republic basically and everybody else has been kind of doing things the same way, and it's all about like violence, and so their whole idea is to try to cultivate what they believe the Force wants, which is to flourish life, tranquility, community, and yet, all these ruling powers to them only want to fight. And so, how do you make a better civilization with that? And which it makes sense why this philosophy would be so appealing to people when you've had 30 years of imperial rule. And, rebellions aren't the only thing built on hope. Our lives in general are just built on hope, and we need that hope. And so now that the empire is gone, people are feeling the ability to have freedom to express themselves in ways that it's basically the explosion of religious freedom here in the Star Wars galaxy, and kind of something that you and I have talked about on Aggressive Negotiations of that idea of that one of the things that Luke maybe was meant to do was to kind of help bring that back out into the galaxy with the Force and evangelize, and that's kind of something that did not happen. And we kind of see these cults exercising their newfound freedom of religion, and that's absolutely fascinating. And I'm with you. I would have loved more of that.
Yeah, and that is even a thread that it's puzzling to me that they don't follow or pull on, or whatever you want to say, with it, mixing up my analogy or whatever, but like that would be interesting in and of itself if there was some sort of payoff where you found out that Luke was, conducting outreach to these groups to try to establish this idea of, well, maybe we can all work together because I'm supposed to find a new way and not establish a Jedi Order. So let's see what we can share with each other and figure out so that I don't make the same mistakes of the past, sort of thing. And the thing is, and even just talking about it just makes me more frustrated about the way things did go, because it's like, especially because there's been this whole, thread in the comics and everything with Luke is hunting down artifacts and looking up the history of the Jedi in the past and everything like that. Like, this sort of thing could tie very much into, why wouldn't, you want to tie Hera in, why wouldn't there be sort of an alert from the New Republic to be like, it's of interest if you encounter any Force believers to maybe, send us a note so that somebody can come out and talk to them and try to figure things out, or at least figure out, some sort of theological summit or something, who knows, what have you. And that would be an interesting sort of thing to, tie these characters in that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, again, what I'm finding with a lot of this sequel era, in the books specifically, is that there are lots of good ideas that are not being allowed the ability to be truly fleshed out, and it's just this kind of hodgepodge of things that's like, we're going to put a little this in there and a little this in there, and it doesn't feel as cohesive, and part of that is, I think I get the feeling like there's, again, just so much that these authors are not able to do that they might want to do.
Right.
And, we had a whole aggressive negotiation on, the different eras of Star Wars books and literature. And I think, this era, one of the things that makes me more excited to be in, so like the next book we'll be covering here on the network, is the book about Poe, and, what had him kind of leave his dad after his mother died and kind of get into spice running and meet, Zori Bliss and all that. And, to me, that's a fascinating story. I want to know more about that because it connects with a character that I really like and all those kind of things, and it kind of helps set up all that stuff, which is great in much the same way that, and it's what's funny, it's one of the young adult books, which those have tended to be, at least in the sequel trilogy era, I found a little bit better.
More
for the
rewarding.
most part. More rewarding.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm more rewarding. And I think that's the thing that I come down to here, just as I'm kind of coming to the end of this and kind of thinking about ratings, is that there is a good thought process behind a lot of this. Mm-hmm. But it just is not executed in a way that makes it truly enjoyable now to really read. Mm-hmm. And rewarding in its reading. And we've talked about that many times. If you're going to read a tie-in novel, it needs to be rewarding to you in the sense that it helps expand the universe in a way that it changes the way you watch something, whether
right.
it's one of the TV shows, whether it's the movies. And I would say the Alphabet Squadron books honestly don't change anything for me and anything that we've seen. And that's not good enough. It's just not. And so I guess for me, I'd say my rating is honestly 2.5 out of 5 stars, because there's some good stuff here, but it's just not allowed to be executed to the fullest extent.
Same spot. 2.5 stars from me. Freed is a good writer. I like his style. I think that there are certain points where he has a really good gift with imagery and metaphor and stuff like that. But yeah, it's not as rewarding as it should be. And
right.
So yeah, I'm right there, 2.5. If you look it up on Goodreads, I get, because Goodreads only gives full star ratings. So I rounded up to a 3 on there, just because it's really weird. I just don't want to say the word blame or anything, but like I don't blame Freed. I know he's a good writer, and so I think that there should be better guidance for the writers, and maybe even a little bit more freedom for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think freedom is a good key word, is to open up things a little bit more, and possibly, giving them enough structure to where you can say, look, you can't touch this, this, and this, right? Because we're going to be going into that in The Mandalorian. But, the rest of it's great. I think that's kind of what we need, right, is just to be able to have these guys and these writers, just to have that freedom. And so, John, I'm interested, though, because we always end the show with recommendations. And so I'm fascinated to see what you are going to be recommending to the people today. My goodness. You know what? I didn't come as prepared as I should have been, but I can tell you that recently I decided to rewatch Rambo First Blood Part 2. Oh, nice.
And I haven't watched that movie in many, many years, but what I will say is this, is the reason I would recommend it is Vietnam left a very deep psychological scar on American society. And this actually the screenplay was co-written by James Cameron, who the research he did for this actually led to the creation of the movie Aliens. So a great thing came from this film. But it's a very interesting film to watch, specifically because its concern is about POW MIA, which was a very big thing in the 80s as regards to the Vietnam War. But also, it goes for broke in the end of it, and just becomes a really interesting precursor to the John Wick level of indestructible action hero sort of stuff. And at the time, the level of violence in it was somewhat controversial. It was an incredibly violent action movie, and to rewatch it now, or to watch it for the first time, you will look at it and you will say, this is a lesson in desensitization, because in the 80s, this was considered like, oh my gosh, look at how violent this is. And the aforementioned John Wick has more brutal awfulness in it than the last 30 minutes of this movie, which, like, the last 30 minutes is just a running gun battle, basically. So, it's pretty interesting stuff.
It's interesting because I just finished reading, and by the time this will have come out, my written review for it will be out. But they released, they had done Myths and Fables for Star Wars, which I found to be a really fun, imaginative book, kind of a great idea to talk about, basically fairy tales and myths throughout the Star Wars galaxy. Well, they have now done Star Wars Dark Legends, which is basically the spooky, scary story version for the dark side of that. And I found it to be very fun. It was an enjoyable read. It's the kind of thing where you kind of want to almost pull it out like during Halloween season, and read spooky stories to the kids. But what was also fascinating to me is just how well the author really played with the Sith principles of greed and envy and anger and pride and all of these things, and really works these into these stories. And I just really enjoyed it. It's the kind of thing that it's just so much fun. You're really having fun with Star Wars in that sense. And having stories about Sith lords and people doing dumb things,
right?
Falling, haunted orphanages, and that kind of stuff. It was fun.
Cool.
If you like a kind of a slightly more morbid, scary Star Wars, this was really enjoyable. So I definitely recommend Dark Legends. But John, before we get out of here, where can everybody find you online?
Oh, just look for Kessel Junkie. That's my online name. On your social network of choice. Letterboxd is probably where I have the most fun. You can also find me over at kesseljunkie.com. When we record this, I've been writing a lot, so have fun with that. And you can find me over on the Nerd Party Network on a charming little show, at least I think it's charming, that is all about Star Wars. It's called Aggressive Negotiations. And I have a wonderful time co-hosting that with somebody. Actually, it's you, Matt. I co-host it with you.
Well, John, you can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, Vero under the name MattRushing02. You can also find me here on the network doing The Orb with Chris Jones talking about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. We also, I do Aggressive Negotiations with you, but I'm also doing Owl Post over on the Nerd Party Network with Drea Kaufman as we talk about the Harry Potter series one chapter at a time. But we just want to say thank you so much for joining us, and may the Force be with you.